we actually drive on the right-hand side of the car and we drive on the left-hand side of the road. Completely opposite to what it is in the US. So for those of you in America, let's take a look at what it's like driving on the right-hand side.
A good rule of thumb to remember is that Britain and most former British colonies, including India, Australia and South Africa, drive on the left, while continental Europe and the USA drive on the right. Cars in Australia drive on the left-hand side of the road, with the driver's seat situated in the right-hand section of the car. This rule has been in place well before cars were even invented. In fact, it's been this way for thousands of years, ever since Roman times. Back then, it made sense to drive on the left because most people were, and still are, right-handed. By driving on the left and sitting on the right, the driver was free to use his strong hand to greet oncoming traffic. It also meant that swordsmen were able to attack oncomers with their strong hand if they needed to. There are other practical reasons that are still relevant today for driving on the left. Most people's right eye is stronger than their left, and driving on the left-hand side of the road means that their dominant eye is in a better position to spot oncoming traffic. Left-hand drive is now used in 165 countries and territories, including the Americas, continental Europe, and a majority of mainland Asia. Another interesting fact is that most windscreen wipers are preferentially designed to better clean the driver's side of the windscreen, and thus have a longer wiper blade on the driver's side and a wipe up from the passenger side to the driver's side. On left-hand drive configurations, they wipe up from the right to the left, viewed from inside the vehicle, and they do the opposite on right-hand drive vehicles. Looking at other regions, it's entirely possible to drive from China to Hong Kong or vice versa, but there are a few things that you should probably know before you attempt to do the trip. While mainland China drives on the right-hand side of the road, in former British colony Hong Kong, they drive on the left, which can make for some pretty confusing road trips. An exception to the British Commonwealth trend is Japan, which was never a British colony, and yet drivers in Japan still drive on the left-hand side of the road. This custom dates all the way back to the Edo period from 1603 to 1807, when samurai swordsmen ruled the country. Much like their British counterparts, needed their strong hand free to deal with potential oncoming enemies. Left-hand driving in Japan didn't become official, however, until the 1870s, when the country's first railway was built. It was the British who helped construct the railway network featuring left-hand side running tracks. When cars were introduced in Japan in the 20th century, it made sense for them to also travel on the left-hand side. The US Virgin Islands is an unusual place to drive. This is the only region under United States jurisdiction where the rule is to drive on the left side of the road. However, almost all the cars have left-sided driver's seats because they've been imported from mainland US. This can make it a little bit difficult to navigate the roads, whether you're from Australia or the UK and used to driving on the left, or you're from the US and used to sitting on the left. Apparently, there's no real evidence to suggest that this mishmash of rules leads to more accidents on the road among native US Virgin Island residents. However, accidents among visiting Americans are relatively frequent. I would suggest maybe this is in part because of the confusing driving rules. Unlike the rest of continental Europe, Malta and Cyprus are two countries that drive on the left-hand side of the road. According to some sources, the main reason most countries today drive on the right-hand side of the road is because of one single left-handed man, Napoleon Bonaparte. Legend has it that the emperor was more comfortable on the right-hand side of the road, with his dominant hand free and able to attack oncomers. Others claim that it was an act of revolution to drive on the right, as aristocrats drove on the left. Whatever the reason, it's now the done thing in most of the world to drive on the right, with the driver's seat situated on the left. Looking at the US, even though America was colonized by the British, we drive on the right-hand side of the road rather than the left. Now, some people think that this was a deliberate act of rebellion, seen as a way of casting off all ties with the UK after gaining independence. It could also be due to the emergence of animal drivers in the 1700s, also known as teamsters, who would haul farm products in large wagons that needed to be pulled from several pairs of horses. The driver would sit on the left rear horse so that he could keep his right hand free to whip the other horses. And naturally, as he was sitting on the left, he wanted oncoming traffic to pass on the left so that he could see oncomers clearly and look down to make sure he kept clear of the other wagon's wheels. Now, Canada is another unusual one because although Canada is a part of the British Commonwealth, they actually drive on the same side as what the US does. So initially they drove on the left, just like the UK, but at the same time, some French-influenced Canadian regions like Montreal and Quebec drove on the right-hand side of the road. So in the 1900s, Canada made it a regulation to drive on the right, in order to avoid accidents as well as to make border crossings with America easier and more seamless. Another thing to remember is that if you are driving a right-hand drive vehicle, you will be changing gears if you're driving a stick with your left hand. And finally, roundabouts. In Australia and other countries that drive on the right-hand side of the vehicle, you are going to be going clockwise around the roundabout, whereas in the US and other left-hand drive countries, you will be going counterclockwise. That's another one that can take a little bit of getting used to.